Welcome everyone. Today we will discuss what would have happened if the Reconquista failed. Now, as a bit of historical context, ever since the fall of Rome, Iberia, the land we know today as Spain and Portugal, was controlled by various Germanic kingdoms, with the Visigoths eventually ruling the entire peninsula. By the late 600s, the Visigoths were in deep decline and were conquered by the Umayyad Caliphate. The Umayyads slowly consolidated the region, but in 716, a former Visigothic noble, Pelagius, started a revolt in the north, which the regional governor tried ending. This resulted in the Battle of Covadonga in 718. This battle was an Umayyad loss and resulted in the formation of the Kingdom of Asturias. After the Abbasid Revolution, the Umayyads stayed in Iberia and rebranded themselves as the Emirate and later Caliphate of Cordoba. Cordoba would slowly lose land to Asturias, and by the 1000s, both Asturias and Cordoba would later break apart into smaller kingdoms, and after 300 years, Asturias' successors successfully conquered most of Iberia, leaving only Granada in the south as a remnant of Cordoba. In the 1480s, Aragon and Castile united to form Spain, and in 1492, Spain conquered Granada, ending the almost 700 years of Muslim rule in Iberia and finishing the Reconquista. That same year, Spain discovered the New World, and the Spanish Empire would be born. But what if this never happened? Today we will answer that question, but before starting the scenario, I would greatly appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel, as it would help me create more alternate history scenarios just like this. I've also created a schedule for my next videos, so keep that in mind. But without any further ado, let's start the scenario. Our story would begin in 718 during the Battle of Covadonga. Here we will have the Umayyads win the battle, and this battle needs to be decisive. Here Pelagius would be killed, along with most of the nobles, resulting in Asturias never forming. This would result in the Reconquista never starting, and the Umayyads continue to rule Iberia even after the fall of the Umayyad Caliphate. Cordoba, like in our timeline, would experience a golden age, with Cordoba becoming one of the largest cities in Europe and the world. In the late 700s, Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, would declare war on Cordoba and would win. He would carve up a buffer zone between the Franks and the Cordobans called the Spanish March. The Spanish March would exist for almost 200 years. When the Franks started decentralizing, Cordoba would strike and annex the Spanish March. By the 1000s, Cordoba would become highly unstable and would collapse into smaller kingdoms called taifas. These taifas would start squabbling between themselves, and some southern taifas would call a North African Berber company called the Almoravids for help. Seeing Iberia in such a state, the Almoravids would conquer southern Iberia. Seeing this, the taifas in the north would slowly get behind the Emir of Leon. The northern taifas, after combining, would defeat the Almoravids and later Almohads. The Iberians would reconquer Iberia, and by the late 1200s would form Al-Andalus. Al-Andalus would slowly start rebuilding and working to rekindle their golden age. While this is going on in Iberia, in the rest of the world, things have also happened. France, due to its close proximity to Al-Andalus, would be extremely paranoid, with border conflicts and disputes being a normal occurrence between the two. The rise of the Habsburgs would still happen, along with the Burgundian succession, but they won't be able to keep the lowlands for long without the vast resources of the Spanish Empire, leading to the Netherlands being formed much earlier. In the Middle East, after the fall of the Abbasids, Al-Andalus would proclaim itself as the Caliphate, and the Emir would marry into the house of the Umayyads to secure his legitimacy. This would mean Umayyad rule continues at Al-Andalus, with most of North Africa seeing them as the rightful caliphs. On the linguistic side of things, Al-Andalus would be speaking a language of Iberian Romance origin, much like Spanish and Portuguese. This would be further secured after the less Arab and Berber-influenced north reconquers Iberia, with Al-Andalus speaking a language similar to Spanish and Portuguese, but writing with the Arabic script instead. On the religious side of things, Iberia would be overwhelmingly Muslim, with them making up 85% of the population. The Jewish population, who would make up 5%, would be staying in Iberia, especially after they supported the north against the Almohads. In our timeline, they were kicked out by the Spanish, but here they aren't and become a protected minority in Al-Andalus, while Christians would make 10% of the population. Their situation would be like that in Egypt, where they would be there, but due to their numbers, they wouldn't be able to affect the future of Al-Andalus. On the ethnic side of things, Andalusians would make up 60% of the population. Catalonians, Basques, and Galicians would make up 30%, and Arabs and Berbers in the south will make up 10% of the population. By the 1400s, Al-Andalus conquers Morocco to strengthen its position in North Africa, and just a few years later, in 1453, the Ottomans conquer Constantinople. With this, it would start a rivalry between the Ottomans and Al-Andalus, which would exacerbate when the Ottomans conquer Egypt and proclaim themselves as caliphs, directly coinciding with the claim of the Umayyad caliphs in Al-Andalus. While after the fall of Constantinople and the end of the War of Roses, Christopher Columbus, the Genoese sailor, would get sponsored by England so that he can conduct an expedition in the Atlantic to find a new route to India and the spice trade. By 1494, Christopher Columbus would discover the New World, and just 6 years after that, the Andalusians, like the Portuguese of our timeline, would discover Brazil by accident while going on a voyage for the sub-Saharan slave trade. Initially, they would just trade with the locals, while the English, like the Spanish, would conquer the Aztec Empire after Old World diseases started destroying Aztec civilization. This would bring insane amounts of wealth to the English coffers, and once again turning England into a great power. Seeing English successes, more European powers become interested in the colonization of the Americas. France, Andalus, the Netherlands, and even the Ottomans would establish colonies in America. The Andalusian colony would be called Alemania, with its name coming from the Amazon. This colony would be spread out in modern-day Bolivia, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Argentina. The colony would be a mix of settler colonialism and ethnic assimilation of the locals. The Andalusians would also encounter the Incas and start trading with them. The Andalusians wouldn't see any worth in conquering them, and would trade with them, slowly bringing Islam to the Incas. The Incas would initially get hit by Old World diseases, but would start recovering and flourishing again, and they would loosely ally with Al-Andalus. In the Caribbean, England, France, the Ottomans, the Dutch, and Al-Andalus would clash over the rich islands and would carve out their territories. In Africa, Al-Andalus would conquer Western Sahara and the coastal parts of West and Central Africa to gain more access to the sub-Saharan and Atlantic slave trades, which they heavily participated in our timeline. Aside from Al-Andalus, the English would colonize and develop the rich colony of New England, which would grow to encompass Mexico, most of Central America, California, and other large territories, attracting millions of Englishmen to migrate to the region. France would colonize Quebec, Louisiana, and parts of the 13 colonies of our timeline. This colony would be massive but underdeveloped and underpopulated, with it being populated mainly by Frenchmen and natives, and later on Italians and Irish too. The Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, without English interference, would grow to encompass parts of the 13 colonies. It would be known as New Holland and would primarily be inhabited by Dutch, Germans, natives, and Scandinavians. The Guianas would get carved up by Britain, France, and the Netherlands. Finally, the Ottomans would colonize parts of Central America, Colombia, and Venezuela. This colony would be highly unstable and underdeveloped, with the Ottomans only owning it for power projection. This colony would be inhabited mainly by Greeks, Slavs, Arabs, Kurds, and Turks. The Ottomans would use it to dump other ethnicities after rebellions, increasing the amount of Turks in Anatolia and the Balkans. Now, getting back to Europe, would enter the 1500s, where to balance things out against the Franco-Ottoman alliance, Al-Andalus would loosely ally with the Habsburgs and the English. Also, due to no Spain, England wouldn't ditch Catholicism, but Protestantism would still remain prominent in major port cities and other areas, and would generally get accepted. Entering the 1600s, the consequences of no Spain would mean that the Catholics and the Habsburgs lose the 30 Years' War, with Protestantism spreading more into the Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburg grip on power loosening. Protestant Bohemia would become independent of Habsburg rule and would challenge them in the HRE for the position of the emperor. Though this doesn't mean that the Ottoman siege of Vienna is successful, and the Ottomans do still get kicked out of Hungary, but would still keep some border regions. While all this is going on, Al-Andalus has slowly declined in power and would even lose Algeria to the Ottomans. Their colony of Alemania would increasingly start to act independently while getting influenced by the Incas. In the 1700s, Al-Andalus would slowly recover and remain a strong and medium power. In the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars, Al-Andalus would ally with revolutionary and later Napoleonic France out of necessity. To start, it would go well, but soon Napoleon's ego would get the best of him, and he would distrust his ally. Napoleon would invade Al-Andalus. In propaganda imagery, he would present himself like Charlemagne, who almost 1,000 years ago beat the Saracens. The French would slowly get stuck, and the war would drag on. After the War of the Seventh Coalition, Al-Andalus, alongside Britain and the rest of the great powers, would defeat Napoleonic France. As we get into the Victorian era, Andalus would finally lose its grip over Alamannia, and in 1825 it would break free to form the Empire and later Republic of Amazonia. Al-Andalus during the Victorian era would slowly industrialize to close the power gap between it and the rest of Europe. They would also join the concert of Europe. By the 1880s, Al-Andalus's efforts would pay off as it would manage to industrialize, but its glory days were long gone. During the scramble for Africa, France would manage to snatch Morocco from Al-Andalus and its West African and Central African holdings, but it would be allowed to keep Western Sahara and the Riba coast. During both world wars, Al-Andalus would stay neutral, taking this time to modernize by European standards. During the Cold War, they would join NATO and later the EU to better integrate with the rest of Europe. By the modern day, they would lose all their colony but would still manage to be a rich nation, integrated with the rest of Europe. But this is where I'll end the scenario. If you have any suggestions, leave them in the comments down below. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.